Hollywood was always too bright. The lights burned not just on the stage, but into the marrow of the people who stood beneath them. And yet, for every spotlight, there was always a shadow, long, silent, and unrecorded. Those shadows are where the real stories lived. In the shimmering swirl of gowns, tuxedos, and champagne-soaked premieres, love itself became dangerous. To hold the wrong hand, to whisper to the wrong person, to let a gaze linger half a second too long, it was enough to risk a career, a fortune, a carefully built life. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. The industry built illusions like palaces, perfect marriages, perfect romances, perfect images of desire projected 10 feet tall. But behind them were people who longed, who ached, who sometimes dared to love in the wrong direction. And for those 16 stars, that love became both a sanctuary and a secret sentence. The role made her famous. It also broke her. He wore tuxedos on screen. In real life, he wore guilt. Some of them buried their hearts in silence, hiding behind staged photographs and stories planted in the press. Others risked it all, gambling with gossip columns, desperate to steal even one night of honesty. The audience believed the kiss, but he'd already fallen out of love. Hollywood has always clapped when its stars entered a room, but no one noticed when they left. Their names stayed on posters, but not on the lips of those they truly loved. Tonight, we walk into those hidden rooms, where love was not scandal, but survival, where hearts beat softly in the wrong direction, and where truth, though buried, still glimmers like a forgotten reel of film waiting to be played. 16 stories, 16 souls. Cary Grant was more than a movie star. He was an invention. Born Archie Leach, he left behind a childhood of shadows and remade himself into Hollywood's most polished dream. On screen, he was the man who knew exactly what to say, how to walk into a room, how to kiss a woman with effortless grace. Off-screen, the script was never so simple. In the 1930s and 40s, Cary shared a home in Santa Monica with fellow actor Randolph Scott. The press called them roommates, though the photographs told another story. Two men barefoot by the pool, reading the paper in matching deck chairs. Two men in a kitchen, cooking breakfast side by side, laughing with the ease of family. The studio spun it as good publicity, a way to make Cary seem approachable, but those who looked closely saw tenderness in their smiles, a comfort not staged for cameras. Cary would marry women 5 times, each one as carefully public as a premiere, but the quiet gravity of Scott always lingered. Hollywood never allowed him to speak what lived in his heart, so he carried it in silence, dressing his truth in tuxedos, guarding it in shadows. His most enduring role was never filmed. It was the part of a man who longed to be free, but could never say why. Rock Hudson was the kind of man Hollywood built myths upon. He was tall enough to fill a doorway, handsome enough to silence a room, gentle enough to make millions believe in love again. In the glow of the screen, he was the steady hand, the patient suitor, the man who made women in the audience sigh and lean closer to the flickering light. But outside the soundstage, his real life was written in shadows. The studios arranged his romances, staged photographs with leading ladies, choreographed strolls along sunlit boulevards, even a marriage designed more for headlines than for happiness. Rock played along, smiling that disarming smile, his laughter ringing out just as his publicist required. Yet away from the cameras, in the hushed corners of Hollywood's backstreets, he let the mask slip. There, with trusted friends and secret loves, he could exhale, touch without fear, and allow his tenderness to surface. For decades, his secret was Hollywood's open whisper, protected not out of kindness, but out of profit. He was too valuable, too adored, for the truth to be spoken. And so Rock carried his storm in silence, a man loved by millions, but rarely allowed to love as himself. Montgomery Clift arrived in Hollywood like a ghost from another world. Where others wore their beauty like armor, his seemed fragile, almost breakable, as if tragedy had brushed his face before the cameras ever found him. His voice was gentle, halting at times, yet every syllable felt alive with truth. He was not the polished hero, not the effortless matinee idol. He was the trembling hand, the furrowed brow, the gaze that revealed wounds the world could not see. Women fell in love with him, certain that his sorrow could be healed by devotion. But Monty's heart often strayed elsewhere, into quiet apartments, into secretive friendships with men who recognized his unspoken hunger. They shared cigarettes in the dark, drove through the night with radios low, and touched hands in fleeting moments when the world wasn't watching. His intimacy was never flamboyant, never careless. It was careful, hidden, almost sacred. Then came the crash. A car twisted on a winding road, his face forever altered. Yet the accident only revealed what had always been there: a fracture, an ache, a yearning that no studio machine could polish away. In his films, from the soldier haunted by memory to the lover caught in silence, you glimpse his true confession. Monty was always searching, not for fame, but for love that would let him finally rest. James Dean was a flame too fierce for the world to contain. He arrived on screen like a storm, leather jacket, cigarette perched between restless fingers, eyes that spoke more than any line of dialogue ever could. To a generation, he was rebellion incarnate, a mirror for every unspoken frustration, every unchained desire. Yet beyond the posters and the myth, there was another story flickering in the shadows. Dean was known to vanish when the spotlights grew too bright. One moment he was the center of a crowded Hollywood party. The next he had disappeared into side streets and dimly lit diners, where the air was quieter, freer. With men he trusted, he found a different kind of intensity, not the performance of stardom, but the raw exchange of secrets and touch. These were relationships never meant for headlines, fragile bonds nurtured in silence. His love life mirrored his racing, daring, impulsive, breathtaking, and never destined to last. Every romance was a burst of speed, a curve taken too sharply, a flash of beauty that ended before it could settle into comfort. And perhaps that was the truest rebellion of all. The world crowned him a rebel without a cause, but James Dean carried two rebellions, one for the cameras and one hidden in his heart, where love answered to no rules at all. Laurence Olivier was the crown jewel of the stage, the man who seemed born to speak Shakespeare's lines as though they were carved into his very soul. When he stepped onto the boards, the world bent toward him. Audiences held their breath at his command. He could summon thunder with a pause, or silence an entire theatre with a single glance. His art was monumental, and yet, behind the brilliance, there lived another man, quieter, concealed, layered like the characters he played. Olivier's life in the public eye was gilded with celebrated marriages, glittering premieres, and romances that filled the gossip columns. He seemed every inch the leading man both on stage and off. But like all great actors, he understood masks, and he wore his own with exquisite precision. In rehearsal halls and backstage corners, the intimacy he shared with certain colleagues went unrecorded, hidden between the lines of plays, whispered in glances, preserved in shadows. To act was, perhaps, his safest confession. On stage, Olivier could bleed openly, pour his longing into Hamlet's soliloquy or Othello's torment, and no one would suspect the secrets folded within. His true self never took a bow. Instead, it lingered just behind the curtain, unseen but undeniable, a man who loved as deeply as he performed, even if the world was never meant to know. Rock Hudson was the dream made flesh, the kind of man Hollywood sculpted into myth. Tall, square-jawed, with a smile that could light a screen in Technicolor, he was every studio's golden ticket. Women swooned, men envied, and the nation believed in him as the very embodiment of romance. He was proof that Hollywood's illusions could step out of the projector's beam and walk among us. But what the world adored was also what caged him. Behind the glitter of premieres and the flash of cameras, Rock carried a truth he could never declare. In a time when even whispers of difference could end a career, his heart learned to live in silence. He found refuge in quiet apartments, in the company of men who knew the same solitude, who understood the language of glances and fleeting touches. But every moment of tenderness had to vanish before dawn, folded back into secrecy. The studios knew. They managed not just his films, but his very life, drafting contracts that choreographed who he appeared beside, which actresses were staged as his companions, what kind of man he was supposed to be. On screen, he kissed with conviction. Off-screen, he carried the hollow ache of concealment. For Rock Hudson, love became both sanctuary and prison, a locked room behind studio gates filled with fleeting warmth, forever guarded by silence. James Dean was a restlessness given form, a young man who carried thunder in his silence and longing in the set of his jaw. He walked into Hollywood like a storm, leather jacket slung across his shoulders, his gaze both defiant and wounded. On screen, he became the voice of every misfit who had ever ached to belong, every lonely heart that beat too fast against the world's indifference. Off-screen, that same yearning followed him like a shadow. Those who drew near spoke of a gentleness hidden beneath the rebel pose, a tenderness searching for a name. Friends, lovers, companions. The lines blurred, for Dean was always shifting, always afraid to linger too long where the light might expose him. Hollywood whispered, as it always does. The rumors curled around his friendships with men who seemed to know him in ways the cameras never could. Yet, in the glare of studio expectation, he never dared to make such truths visible. He lived urgently, as if he knew time was not his ally. Every love was fleeting, tucked away in secrecy, every longing concealed beneath the myth of rebellion. And when he left the world at just 24, he was sealed forever in the image of the restless boy. Yet, if you look closely at the photographs, at the haunted light in his eyes, you see not rebellion, but a soul searching endlessly for tenderness, for freedom, for home. Montgomery Clift was a vision of contradiction, fragile yet unyielding, luminous yet shadowed. He stepped into Hollywood as though carved from porcelain, a prince of vulnerability in a kingdom of steel-jawed heroes. His beauty was undeniable, a quiet force that unsettled as much as it enchanted. Yet behind the elegance of his frame, behind the tremor of his voice, there lived a soul aching for refuge. The world adored him for what it could see, but Monty's truest self remained hidden in the dim corners of private rooms, in whispered conversations where masks could finally fall away. With men he trusted, he found a rare gentleness, a fleeting sanctuary where he could breathe without performance. But such bonds could not survive the flashbulbs and the gossip pages. Silence was his protection, though silence too was a prison. Even before the fateful crash that shattered his face, Monty seemed pursued by sorrow. The accident merely carved into his skin what had long been written in his spirit. He drank to blur the edges of truth, to quiet the relentless echo of his own longing. His performances became a mirror. Wounded men, fractured hearts, fragile heroes. Montgomery Clift did not need scripts to embody despair. He lived it. He carried heartbreak in his eyes, in the slope of his shoulders, in the bruised silence that followed him everywhere. His tragedy was not that he broke, but that the world only loved him for his breaking. He was the picture of perfection, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline that seemed carved for the silver screen. To the public, Rock Hudson was the embodiment of the American dream, the soldier, the husband, the irresistible leading man. Women sighed when he smiled, and men admired the strength he projected with effortless grace. Yet the very image that made him Hollywood's golden boy was also the cage in which he was trapped. Behind the posters and premieres lay another truth, one forbidden, one carefully hidden. Hudson loved men, tenderly and quietly, but such a reality was incompatible with the machinery of stardom. The studio arranged marriages, photo shoots, and endless appearances designed to polish his mask. He played along, not because he wanted to deceive, but because survival demanded it. In private, love became a secret rebellion. He cherished stolen hours with companions who could never be named, glances exchanged at parties where danger lurked in every whisper. His heart was alive, but it beat in silence. When illness came, the mask finally cracked, and the world glimpsed the truth he had carried alone. Today, Rock Hudson is remembered not only for the roles he played, but for the courage of simply existing in a world that demanded he deny himself. His story is not just one of secrecy. It is one of resilience, longing, and the cost of a dream too fragile for honesty. Marlon Brando did not simply act, he detonated on screen, tearing down the old language of performance and replacing it with something primal, electric, undeniable. He was not merely watched, he was felt, every line of his body charged with restless intensity. Yet, away from the cameras, his desires were just as untamed. Brando's love life was a constellation without fixed stars, expanding beyond the narrow orbits society demanded. He gave his heart where it landed, to men, to women, to fleeting flames that burned brightly in the dark. Hollywood's rumor mills spun endlessly. Affairs with leading ladies whispered in the same breath as intimacies with men whose names remained tucked in sealed envelopes. To Brando, none of it was shameful. Love was not meant to be fenced in by categories. His appetites were too wide, his soul too restless for containment. Yet he rarely declared these truths openly, knowing the industry would not forgive what it could not understand. Instead, Brando's passions bled into his art. Each performance seemed to tremble with the memory of hands that once touched him, lips that once claimed him. His roles were never mere fiction. They were living echoes of a man who desired without boundaries, and who, in that defiance, redefined freedom itself. Tab Hunter's rise to stardom was a carefully orchestrated illusion. Warner Brothers sculpted him into the embodiment of 1950s innocence, golden hair, sea blue eyes, and the kind of all-American grin that reassured anxious parents their children's idols were wholesome. He was marketed as the boy who could have lived next door, mowing the lawn with sleeves rolled up, or driving a convertible beneath the California sun. But behind the still photographs and studio-arranged romances with starlets like Natalie Wood, Tab carried a secret heavier than the camera lights. He loved men. In the shadows of parties, in the quiet corners of Los Angeles, he found fleeting solace in arms that were never meant to be seen in public. Hollywood demanded purity, demanded that its leading men uphold fantasies, and so Tab learned to live as two people. The actor adored on screen, and the man silenced in private. Rumors simmered, scandals threatened, and the studio scrambled to shield him. Yet even as fear haunted him, Tab's spirit never hardened. Later in life, when he finally spoke openly, it was not with bitterness, but with grace. His survival was its own quiet rebellion, proof that even in disguise, the boy next door had always been real. Anthony Perkins stepped into Hollywood with a softness that disarmed audiences. Tall, slender, almost fragile in demeanor, he carried an awkward grace that made him both endearing and magnetic. When Hitchcock handed him the role of Norman Bates, Perkins became immortalized as the man with shadows stitched into his smile. Yet the true shadows were not scripted. They were the quiet battles of a man asked to suppress his truest self in exchange for survival. In private, Perkins navigated a labyrinth of secrecy. He met lovers in hushed apartments, in fleeting encounters that dissolved with the dawn. He learned to walk the tightrope between desire and exposure, every glance a risk, every touch a calculation. To the public, he remained the sensitive bachelor, the man who seemed always searching for love but never finding it. Behind the curtain, he had already found it, but never safely. Later, marriage and fatherhood offered him a shield, a structure that softened public suspicion. Yet those closest to him knew the duality, the tenderness of a man split between two worlds, his own truth confined by fear. Even now, when we revisit his gaze on screen, we sense it, that unspoken yearning for freedom that history denied but could never erase. Marlon Brando was never just an actor, he was a force of nature, a storm wrapped in human skin. On screen he smoldered with an intensity that unsettled even his co-stars. Off-screen he carried that same unpredictability, a man who lived without a map, chasing sensations as though they were the only truths worth holding. Brando did not play life safely. He devoured it, reckless and tender in equal measure. The public clung to his image as Hollywood's rebel, the dangerous lover, the man who could crush you with a stare. But Brando's affections were never confined to the stories written for him. Behind closed doors, he sought connection where it was forbidden, drawn to men with the same feverish hunger that drew him to women. For him, love was neither scandal nor label. It was oxygen, essential and fleeting. Yet his fire came with a cost. Lovers often found themselves scorched, unable to keep pace with his shifting moods, his restlessness, his longing for permanence he could never quite hold. The world remembers him as a legend of cinema, but those who touched his private life knew another Brando, a man forever searching, forever burning, forever untamed. Anthony Perkins lived as if trapped inside the same haunted house he portrayed on screen. His Norman Bates was not just a role. It was a reflection, a performance of secrets, restraint, and yearning that mirrored his own life. Perkins, with his hesitant smile and fragile posture, seemed always on the edge of vanishing into himself. To audiences, he was unforgettable. To himself, he was a man walking carefully through a maze of shadows. Hollywood adored his nervous elegance. Studios built roles around his restraint, his boyish charm tinged with unease. Yet that unease was not an invention. It was survival. In private, Perkins loved men with the same delicacy he brought to his acting, but he carried that love in silence, terrified of exposure. His romances unfolded in secrecy, in borrowed hours and hidden places where tenderness could briefly bloom without fear. What Perkins longed for most was simplicity, to love without disguise, to live without dread. But fame was a cage, and the world's prejudices pressed heavily against him. He gave cinema his soul, yet his own life remained half-lived, painted over with hesitation. His story is not one of scandal, but of a gentle heart forever caught between fear and desire. James Dean lived as if he knew the clock was already ticking. He carried a storm inside him, restlessness braided with longing, defiance softened by vulnerability. On screen, he became the emblem of youthful rebellion, a slouched body, a cigarette dangling, eyes that seemed to ask questions too heavy for words. Yet away from the camera, Dean searched for something quieter, a place where he could be held without explanation, where desire was not a scandal, but a truth shared in whispers. He loved without boundaries. Men, women. What drew him was intensity, the rare electricity of feeling alive in another's presence. His romances were often fleeting, not because he lacked devotion, but because he lived like a man who knew he was only passing through. In lovers' memories he was mercurial, tender in one breath, distant in the next, as if his soul was already half a step ahead, chasing some horizon only he could see. When the Porsche crashed on that California road, his secrets were buried in the twisted metal, leaving behind only fragments carried in hushed recollections. The myth endures, youth eternal, rebellion immortal, but beneath it lingers the truth of a boy who, for all his brightness, only longed for the simple, unguarded gift of being loved. Noël Coward was the epitome of sophistication, a man who seemed born in a tuxedo, cigarette poised like a prop, words polished until they gleamed. He crafted comedies of manners that unmasked the follies of high society, yet he wore his own mask with equal precision. His wit was his sword and his shield. With a single line, he could silence a critic, charm a duchess, or scatter suspicion into laughter. But beneath the sparkle of champagne glasses and applause lay a quieter truth. Coward loved men, sometimes daringly, more often in secrecy. His romances were transient, written in the margins of his life like stage directions meant never to be read aloud. Lovers arrived like guests at a party, welcomed warmly, dismissed discreetly when the evening was over. His heart, too often tucked away, beat to a rhythm of longing he rarely allowed anyone to hear. In the empty hours, when the lights dimmed and the velvet curtains fell, Coward's loneliness returned like an uninvited guest. He longed for a love unscripted, one he would not need to cloak in charm or wit. His tragedy was not in the brilliance he gave the world, but in the honesty he was never allowed to claim for himself. Outro chapter: The Hidden Symphony of Desire. Hollywood has always been a dream machine, a place where the unreal becomes real, and where stories flicker across the silver screen with the permanence of starlight. Yet for all its glamour and grandeur, the industry's velvet curtains concealed truths too fragile to survive the brightness of the lights. Behind the scripted lines and choreographed romances, there were secret symphonies, notes of love and longing that could not be played aloud. 16 stars walked its stages in this story, their names etched forever into cinema's history. They were dazzling, untouchable, larger than life. Yet behind the lens, each carried a quiet, private truth, that their hearts were drawn toward places the world told them not to look. Some wore their yearning like an unhealed wound. Judy Garland, with her tremulous voice, gave the world songs of heartbreak because she understood the weight of being misunderstood. Montgomery Clift, beautiful and fragile, carried his longing into performances that felt like confessions whispered through the screen. Their pain became part of their art, shaping characters who were both vulnerable and unforgettable. Others chose silence as their armor. Rock Hudson became the picture of Hollywood masculinity, his image crafted by studios that erased the love he lived in secret. Anthony Perkins, haunted and brilliant, kept his desires hidden behind the nervous energy of his roles, fearful of what revelation might cost him. Their films remain icons of cinema, yet the men inside them were asked to bury their own truths beneath the applause. And then there were those who burned in defiance. Marlon Brando, mercurial and untamed, loved without boundaries, turning his desire into fire that reshaped every performance. James Dean, a comet too brief to be contained, blurred the lines of masculinity and vulnerability, his private loves echoing in the restless ache of his characters. Noël Coward, with a glass raised and a clever line always ready, cloaked his truth in wit. A man who brought joy to millions, while longing for the kind of love he could never publicly claim. Each star survived in their own way, though none escaped without scars. They navigated a world where exposure could mean ruin, where the price of honesty was silence, where the most human of needs, to love and be loved, became a dangerous secret. Yet in their restraint, in their whispered romances and fleeting embraces, they carried something profoundly universal, the reminder that love, no matter how hidden, is still love. To speak of their secret lives now is not to scandalize, but to remember. It is to restore humanity to legends, to honor the truth they could not voice. Their desires were not less real because they were hidden. Their hearts were not less brave because they beat in shadows. These stars gave the world their brilliance, and in the quiet rooms beyond the spotlight, they lived out stories that might have destroyed them if told aloud. Tonight, as their films flicker once more, we're invited to see them not only as icons but as people. People who burned, who longed, who feared, who loved. Their art was shaped by those inner symphonies, music written in silence, never performed for the world. And in remembering them, in speaking the truths they were denied, we finally allow that hidden symphony of desire to be heard. It plays softly still, through the trembling of a song, the gaze of an actor, the wit of a playwright, the myth of a rebel. It is fragile, it is beautiful, and at last it is free.